Hello everybody, this is Mr. Stats and Stuff back with another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at BYU's Week 1 matchup against the Portland State Vikings. We'll also be going through the depth chart that was released yesterday to give my full reaction on it. So let's dive in. So we're going to start with the depth chart. Not a lot of surprises in terms of the starters named as far as the offensive and special team side of the ball, but we're going to be going through some of my key takeaways or things that surprised me a little bit about the depth chart that was released yesterday. So starting with the backup QBs, they did not name a clear number two, which was a bit of surprise. However, we're going to assume that McKay Hillstead is the true number two. That would be most likely to come in if Bear Bachmeier were to get injured. But it sounds like there's a possibility if we either have a blowout game and we're sending in another QB, or if we have an injury to Bachmeier, that it's possible you may see Trayson Bourget get some snaps as well this season. As far as the running backs, no surprise as far as the top two, LJ Martin and Sione Moa. We kind of already knew that. The surprise is that Jovessa Damuni was slotted in as the third running back ahead of Enoch Nawahine, who has already played in this offense and taken some snaps in big games like against SMU last year. I think that shows that Demoody had a strong camp at running back. Wide receivers, really no surprises. We kind of knew who the top three guys were, and we know that behind that it's Cody Hagan, Tiger Bachmeier, Reggie Frishnick, and Tay Nakua were the next four up. Um, One thing to note, though, just the way that wide receiver is listed on the depth chart suggests that wide receiver is kind of positionless in this offense. And what I mean by that is if you look at other teams, like say Utah, for example, on their depth charts, when they choose to put them out, um, they'll list their receivers in different positions. So they'll have an X receiver, they'll have a Z receiver, they'll have a slot receiver, etc. But the way BYU lists it, they're all just listed as wide receivers. I don't know that it's necessarily that, the guy that's listed behind Chase Roberts is the backup for his position, and then the guy that's listed behind Parker Kingston is the backup for his position. I really think it's more of, you know, these are the top seven guys. The three that are the starters are the ones that are going to play the most. But you're going to see them line up all over the field. You're not just going to see Roberts line up outside and Kingston line up in the slot, even though maybe that's the most natural spot for them. This is an offense that wants its receivers to be versatile, to play inside and out, and wants to, rotate a lot of bodies in there. So, just something to watch throughout the season is, how each wide receiver fits into this offense. Tight end, not a ton of surprises. Carson Ryan's number one. We kind of knew that. Kian Need, I believe, will be the main blocking tight end in the same role that guys like Matava Taase have fulfilled in past years. And then Erickson and Moyaki will probably see some snaps as well. Probably gonna see a little bit of rotation among those second string tight ends. I do think Need will play more than Erickson or Moriaki by quite a bit. But Carson Ryan, expect him to be on the field almost every snap. Offensive line, looks like the guard spots are still a bit up in the air. Seems like Lapuaho will not play in week one, so I would expect Leosa at right guard and Mocassini at left guard in week one, with Kyle Sforza as the main backup at the interior online positions. Um, but yeah, so a lot of experience at those guard spots. I think that the coaches feel comfortable at about all four guys in the depth chart there. But we may see a little bit of shuffling throughout the first few weeks of the season. Um, as far as the backup O linemen, we really haven't seen many of the backup centers or tackles really take snaps in games. So it'll be interesting to see if we see any of those guys throughout the season, or if maybe any of the underclassmen are able to make a push for appearances on the two deep later in the year, because it was kind of all upperclassmen filling in those backup O line spots. Then the only real insight on special teams is that it's going to be Parker Kingston and Cody Hagan being the guys on kick return. Definitely a couple other options on the team that could fulfill that role, but it looks like they want to give Kingston and also Cody Hagan the green light to start off the year. Now we're going to get into the defense, which is probably the far more interesting aspect of the depth chart that was put out. One thing that stood out right away was that um, Keanu Tanavasa was listed as a nose tackle, and not as the defensive tackle, which is, as far as I understand, more of like the three technique, lining up over the guard slash tackle versus the nose lining up and over the center or between the center and the guard. So that is interesting. I believe he's done some of both in his time at Utah, but it does seem like they view him more as a nose tackle in this defense. Of course, I think you'll still see him line up all over the interior of the offensive line, and they may kind of deploy him in, whatever spot they feel like they can get a good matchup for him in. But a little bit of a surprise there. Also, nose tackle. Doesn't look like Justin Kirkland will play week one, maybe not the next week or two after that. It's interesting. He was listed behind Keanu Tanavasa, which, I think most of us would expect that those two would be on the field together, both playing tackle at the same time. So a bit strange that he was listed as Tanavasa's backup rather than a backup or co-starter at the other D tackle spot. Speaking of the other D tackle spot, John Tamuifea had a strong fall camp. He's going to start week one. Nisi Purcell is going to be the main backup there. And, one of the few freshmen cracking the two deep, Ulavai Fatuli may appear in some games. Difficult for a freshman to take snaps at any position, let alone interior defensive line, just given the size that you have to add between high school and college to do that. But interesting to see that, and we might see him take some snaps early in the season. Now, moving over to defensive end, we have Viliami Pouha and Bodie Schoonover. We're listed as co-starters at the defensive end position. Now, notice that they have a defensive end and an open end or outside edge. I'm not exactly sure what that OE stands for. But so those are viewed a little bit differently in this defense. As far as I understand, the defensive end is more of the big run stuffing um, defensive end that's, maybe more along the lines of 270, 275 pounds. Whereas the OE is more of the pass rush specialist, might be more like 250, 260. So last year you had, Tyler Batty was more of the DE, and then, other names like Isaiah Banya, etc., were more of the OE in this defense. But so, notable that they put their bigger body DNs in that DE spot, whereas more of the smaller but faster pass rush specialists are slotting in at the OE position. That being said, I think that you're going to see a ton of different combinations at these defensive end spots. Um, and in past situations, you might see two guys that are on the depth chart under OE be on the field at the same time. In running situations, it's possible you could see Pauha and Bodie Schoonover together. You might also see them slide inside, especially when BYU goes to a three defensive alignment, which they love to do. So some things to watch there. Um, a lot of things still to be determined at the defensive end position. But notable that Puha and Lutui and Bodie Schoonover will appear to be the starters at this point. A couple other names to note here is that Logan Lutui, it looks like he will start at the OE position, but expect pretty much everybody on there to see a lot of pass rush snaps. In particular, just listening to the interviews, it seems like Coach Papinga and Coach Hill are really high on Hunter Clegg and Tassili Akana. So would not be surprised at all to see them take on an increasing role and maybe even turn into starters or co-starters as the season goes on. Now moving into the second level and third level of the defense. So the Sam linebacker position, we've got Ephraim Asiata making a position change to linebacker, and he will be the primary backup to Blasker. Now, he may be deployed in passing situations. The coaches really like his versatility, ability to both rush the passer and also play coverage. You may possibly see him in 3-4 defenses, kind of be that stand up outside linebacker on the line of scrimmage. They could possibly play even him and Glasker at the same time with, Kelly and either a Sarah or Brian Strother being the inside linebackers in that 3-4 alignment. We saw them go to that 3-4 alignment in a couple of games last year. So, if they go back to that, I think you could see Asiata take a lot of snaps in that one. And that gives him the flexibility to play kind of a PJ Watt or Kyle Van Noy type role where you can, you know, be a real threat in the pass rush while also being able to still drop into coverage. Mac linebacker, co-starters are Sarah and Brian Strother. Sounds like Brian Strother had a really strong fall camp and, earned the ability to be named a co-starter there. I think you'll see a ton of rotation between those two, really throughout the first few weeks of the season until one of them starts to separate a little bit more. Rover linebacker, Ace Kafusi is going to be the primary backup there. Of course, Jack Kelly will be the starter. So that's the linebackers. And moving on to the defensive backs, as we expected, Maury Bamba and Evan Johnson are going to start. And I believe that Trey Alexander is going to be the next guy up. The other corners listed are Dunlap and McKenzie, so they may see some snaps as well. But I think the clear, you know, clear top three are Bomba Johnson and Alexander, and not sure how much we'll see the guys past that. At nickel, big development is that Prasis will start in week one at nickel rather than safety where he played last year, and then DeVries will also play some at that position. Jonathan Capella, who we assumed would be the starter, is going to be out for at least the first week. He may come back and start later in the year. It'd be interesting to see when Cabella is healthy. Do they keep Prasis in the rotation at nickel? Do they slide him back to safety in his more natural position? So, interesting to see there, but definitely Tommy Prasis, is too talented to keep off the field last year as a true freshman. So we should continue to see him a ton this year, regardless of whether he's starting or not. Speaking of safeties, Falatau Satuala was interestingly named a co-starter at both safety spots. So I think he will play a lot even if he doesn't start. Also, in the interview with Kelly Papinga yesterday, it sounded like he will be playing on almost every single special teams unit as well. So definitely a guy that coaches are really high on and want to find ways to get him on the field as much as possible. But it's going to be Tanner Wall and Raider Demooney, probably taking the first snap on Saturday. So that's what I had for the depth chart. Some interesting things to know, a couple of unknowns, but hopefully we'll get a little bit more clarity as we see this first game happen. And speaking of the first game, we actually have some film and stats from Portland State's Week 0 game to look through. So, overall impressions, obviously they had a 42-0 loss to Tarleton State, which is a really good FCS team, top 10 FCS team. And I mean, no way to sugarcoat it. Portland State is not just an FCS team, but probably one of the worst teams in the FCS. Offensively, the main takeaway I had from the limited amount of the game I was able to watch, as well as just looking through box scores, etc., is that their pass game was quite ineffective. Um, they went through three different quarterbacks, taking meaningful reps, and they combined for 51% completion, three interceptions, and 4.8 yards per attempt. That's just not going to get the job done. Not nearly enough completed passes, too many turnovers, and really looks still pretty up in the air who's going to be starting and how many of those guys are going to take reps against BYU. I would expect to see at least two quarterbacks take reps in that game. As far as their run game, their main running back, who's probably one of their better players, was held to 3.2 yards per carry, which is certainly not um, good enough to get the job done, especially against a team like BYU that does have some talent at the interior D line and linebacker spots. Um, Only real sign of success they had is that their more running quarterback, Tyreek Smith, did go for 5 yards a carry. So I think it's possible we may see him take more of the reps against BYU just because, quarterback run is one of the few things that can kind of equalize things against a superior opponent, given that you get the numbers advantage of the extra blocker. So expect to see a heavy dose of quarterback run, just like we saw from Southern Illinois in the opener last year. Special teams wise, some mistakes there as well. You had two missed field goals. You had a fumble on a kick return for Portland State, and overall, just generally poor field position. A lot of Tarleton State's touchdown drives were, on the shorter side, 40 yards, 50 yards, 60 yards instead of 75 yards. So, definitely seems like a weakness that, is not going to fare well against, BYU special teams, which have been emerging as kind of a strength of the team. And as far as Portland State's defense, they had a decent performance in pass defense. They held a pretty good FCS quarterback to 58% completion and 6.3 yards attempt. Those are pretty pedestrian numbers, not bad by any means, but pretty average performance, all things considered. But that being said, they were pretty bad in rush defense. Allowed 7.9 yards per carry, even more if you exclude sacks, and then also gave up some really long explosive runs, including an 89-yard touchdown run, long run by the quarterback. So, expect BYU to run the ball early and often on Saturday. Now we're going into the next segment where I'm giving my 10 bold predictions for what will happen in BYU's game on Saturday. First, I'm going to say that Keanu Tanavasa is going to have a monster game. I'm not sure exactly how much of it will show up in the stat sheet, but I think it's not out of the question that he could have a game with, say, one or more sacks, three or more tackles for loss or run stuffs, and then a batted pass. Defensively, I'm going to go ahead and say that the defense is going to combine for four sacks. And, off the top of my head, if BYU has four sacks, I'd say the guys would be Tanavasa, Clegg, Akana, and Kelly coming up with those sacks. But that would be a sign that BYU's pass rush has taken a major step forward, which it needs to because, despite the success that BYU has had on defense, pass rush remains, rather lackluster, and they finally feel like they have the talent in that defensive end room. They just need to get more out of the talent that they have there. Um, Defense and special teams, I have them combining for three takeaways. Portland State coughed the ball up four times against Tarleton State, so I think there's no reason that a ball hawking defense like BYU can't replicate that performance. Parker Kingston, I'm going to say he has a 30 plus yard kick or punt return, probably punt return. I don't think they're going to be fielding a lot of kickoffs. I'm going to say Will Farron hits a field goal from 50 plus and continues his strong streak going into last season. I'm going to say 10 different players record receptions. I think they're going to be spreading the ball around, rotating a lot of guys in at receiver, getting tight ends and running backs involved in the pass game. I'm going to say four different players score rushing touchdowns. So I think that'd be Martin, Moa, Demouni, and Bachmeyer. Again, I think that BYU is going to have a lot of success in the run game in this game. Um, Next, a bit of a weird one. I think Bachmeyer is going to throw 25 or fewer passes. I don't think they're going to ask him to really carry the load on offense in his first start as a true freshman, even if it is an FCS opponent. I think, they're going to run the whole offense. They're going to have him take some deep shots on play action and stuff like that. But I don't think they're going to be passing a ton on first down, second down. I think they're going to, give him some quick throws to get into rhythm. They're going to give him some play action shots with simple reads. They're really not going to ask him to do too much in this first start. So hopefully, when he does throw the ball, I'm expecting or predicting that he will complete more than 60% of his passes with no turnovers. I think that would be all I need to see from Bachmeier to have a successful first start. And finally, I'm going to predict that Portland State does not score a touchdown. Uh, you know, Definitely possible for BYU to pitch a shutout in this game, but at the very least, I want to see them keep Portland State out of the end zone. And my final predictions for the game, I'm going BYU 44, Portland State 3. Um, you know, that wouldn't quite cover the massive 43.5 point spread, but running up the score is not BYU style. So that's where I'm going for the final score. And finally, just some targets for success. These are things that I want to see to feel like BYU is on track for a successful season. I want to see Bachmeier go for 60% or more completion, 225 or more yards, 2 plus total touchdowns, and no interceptions. This is what I would want to see just to feel like, okay, he can, run the offense, take care of the football. I don't need to see him go for 350 yards and 4 total touchdowns, and have 75% completion. We don't need that kind of a performance from a true freshman in his first career start. But we want to see that he can have success, that he can make the throws that the coaches are asking him to, and that he can make good decisions with the football. BYU rushing offense, I want to see 6 or more yards per carry. I want to see them generate good push in the run game. I want to see, them be able to run both inside and outside. So, that would be a good sign to me that, if Bachmeyer does have some freshman struggles, that they can really lean on this run game when they need to. As far as the overall offense, I want to see more touchdowns than punts and no turnovers. This is a team that BYU should be able to move the ball well and not, be stalling out on third down against. So, I really want to see them move the ball up and down the field, very least get into field goal range on as many drives as possible. I don't want to see a lot of punting in this game from BYU. Defensively, I want to see 3 plus sacks, 2 plus takeaways. As we talked about, this pass rush really needs to take a step forward. But I think that the better defensive tackle play that they should have this year should help a lot with that. But yeah, the key is, can they turn those pressures into sacks and takeaways? And finally, I'm going to say that BYU should have the goal to hold the Portland State offense under 4 yards per carry. This is a team effort, but I think that they have the talent in that room. There's really no excuse to let a team like Portland State run all over you. With that, those are my things to watch, predictions, etc. for BYU's first game. I'm excited to get into this football season and have a lot of interesting videos that I can start making once we get a little bit more data from the first few weeks of games. So, let me know in the comments what you want to see in the next video. Thanks.